Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about trees, which is still my favorite thing to do. What I'm trying today is to bring together a little bit of the literary studies that I do, which is basically approaching everything from the wrong perspective. So I'm doing a thing that I have come to call unprofessional botany now, because I'm not a trained botanist. I'm not a trained plant scientist. I am a trained literary scholar, so I should know better than to read all texts as literary texts and read all non-literary texts or all literary texts as if they wanted to tell me something about the world. One of the texts that is very important to me because it kind of offers me the beginning and end of thinking about trees is Adrienne Rich's poem. I'm going to read it now. What kind of times are these? So, beginning with a poem, what could be better? There is a place between two strands of trees where the grass grows uphill and the old revolutionary road breaks off into shadows near a meeting house abandoned by the persecuted who disappeared into those shadows. I've walked there picking mushrooms at the edge of dread, but don't be fooled. This isn't a Russian poem. This is not somewhere else, but here. Our country moving closer to its own truth and dread, its own ways of making people disappear. I won't tell you where the place is, the dark mesh of the woods, meeting the unmarked strip of light, ghost-ridden crossroads, leave mold paradise. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. I won't tell you where it is. So why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. I'm always trying to figure out what lengths of silence is appropriate to a poem. I never know. But so I have to pace myself because I could talk 2 hours alone about this poem. It is a poem that does what modern poems do, and it talks about being a poem. It tells you it's not Russian poetry. It talks about our country, which in this case is the US. It tells you about histories that it only hints at, so you need to figure them out themselves. You can talk about the Revolutionary Road, you can talk about the Underground Railroad here, but it also tells you something about trees. And one of the poems that you might have detected as a subtext or an intertext to this one is, of course, Bertolt Brecht's poem An die Nachgeborene, to those who came after, where it talks about conversations about trees almost becoming crimes in times where it's politically so fraught to talk about humans. So as if talking about trees were a distraction from the politics of today. And what Adrienne Rich does in, the shortest amount of time, it's almost a crime to shorten it down to this, but luckily I've written a book about it. Anyway, so what she does is turning it upside down and saying, not talking about trees is actually what keeps things hidden. And she plays with this. I'm not going to tell you about the actual trees that I found, the stand of trees that are so special, but I'm going to talk about trees to have you listen. And this is basically the kind of mission statement of my research as well. Because what I want to do, and it's important to see that this poem is from 1995. So we're talking a time when the environmental movement was well established. Plant science is just about to make like a giant leap that brings it into public attention. And eco-criticism, the field of literary studies that I am now most closely working with, is just kind of making it to the surface of attention in the Anglophone world. It takes another 10 years to do so here as well. Not going to judge this, just observing that it sometimes takes longer for things to land here. Anyway, so bringing together trees and politics, bringing together poetry and politics, and kind of merging them or not merging them, kind of putting them at the exact right distance from each other is one of the ways in which talking about trees actually makes inquiry possible. And I say inquiry because I want to find a way of talking about trees that is not only interdisciplinary, but really has a broader understanding of what we want to ask. And it's not a question of whether it's really the humanities as a privileged side of, the kind of proposal language that we use. But finding a way of asking questions together between humanities and science, between people in universities and outside, and between people who dig their hands in the dirt and people like Adrian Rich who don't tell us where the trees grow that we want to see. One of the questions I have learned to address right away is I have been trained as a comparative literature scholar, which gives me a fair amount of freedom in moving between languages and between literary epochs and all kinds of things. I have also been trained as a Germanistin, so a very special kind of German studies scholar. German studies is actually much broader in some respects. So I've often been asked whether I fear, this kind of question at the end of a talk when you are a Nachwuchswissenschaftlerin especially, so an early career research, and someone looks at you and goes like, so, how do you prevent coming across as a tree hugger? And I've been dealing with that question for a longer time now and have decided I will not justify myself anymore, as in trying to defend or trying to pretend that I'm not a tree hugger. So as you can see, I am one. I'm absolutely speaking from a place of love. And I do think that this is important. This is something that, and I want to situate this, is difficult to say in a German language context and in Germany, because being a scholar and someone in love is a difficult thing to do, except if you look at hermeneutics, for example. If you feel the kind of pull a text exerts on you as an interpreter and the kind of push away movement when the text rejects you and kind of refuses to be understood. And this is the way in which I try to find a position towards trees, a standing as a scholar, and ideally maintain some credibility. And the way I do this is by thinking a lot about method and the relationship we can, as scholars, maintain with each other and with other non-humans, which is important. And I say this now because this will be a talk about trees and plants, but make no mistake, the questions we ask, how we deal with trees and how we approach and consider the networks that they might or might not form with other beings, are questions that we could just as well ask when we approach any other non-human, and especially the kind of non-human, maybe intelligence or not intelligence that we call, or that we love to call AI at the moment. But the question between the artificial and the natural is at the center of the questions that I ask, because, and this is my favorite finding of the whole almost 10 years now, is there are no trees. There is no such thing as a tree. A tree is a human invention because a tree is not a plant, but a plant habit. That is, some plants have it in them to become trees under specific circumstances. If you think of hazel, for example, it can just as well become a shrub as it can become a tree. So a tree is an aesthetic concept that helps botanists and non-botanists to group together certain plants that have a specific habit, but talking about trees is in effect already a cultural act. And that's where I come in. And what I try to show you today is how literary and cultural plant studies approaches plants as plants, and that is not turning them into metaphors or symbols or something that resembles what we usually deal with. The kind of amount of strange, from my perspective, or unknown, or, the kind of science we need to do that and to make actual claims, and the kinds of questions that are asked, and the kind of demands that makes in order for us as scientists, as scholars, to position ourselves and to say, again, this is a very much more threatening thing to a German than it is to almost all scholars from all disciplines in all other parts of the world, where it forces us to say I and question what that I or even we could mean. And just to point it out, I brought you the letters that Katie Holton made. She's an artist who designed several actually tree fonts where she designs site-specific. She has an NYC tree font and one for Dublin. This is a more general European tree font that you can download, and then you can procrastinate by turning your text into tree. This one says, let's talk about trees. I'm sure you noticed it's a lime tree, and then you go on. With that, and that is one of the things that I look at where and how artists try to use their means of representing the world in order to disrupt our way of understanding. So the big claim about the hermeneutics is basically the question of how can we better understand and how can we stop expecting to understand the things just because we see them and use this disruption of understanding. So the making things illegible rather than making them legible through thinking with trees. So one of the ways, and this is why the tree alphabet is so interesting, Katie Holton's tree alphabet, she's written this great book or compiled this great book, The Language of Trees, if you're interested, is because using trees and plants more generally, mostly trees and flowers, in order to represent human language. So make them into signs. Isabel Kranz has compiled this beautiful book, Sprechende Blumen. She's also written about so-called floriography, which is the art of sending messages by means of flowers. So you can, for example, you might know this from romance novels or historical movies, where people can give you a flower bouquet, and then it says, let's meet under the old oak tree in 2 days at sundown, for example, or it sends a message of love or like a more saucy message of things that you wouldn't say in words because you are a proper lady, for example. And it is a language that has had its peak in the 19th century. And Isabel Kranz argues not as a language that has ever been particularly useful, because most of the flowers you need, you get a little book and then it says, for example, a peony stands for this and something else stands for something other. So very useful because one plant means one thing, which is a very nice idea of language, which has like one meaning. But Isabel Kranz's argument is that this kind of language has been so popular in the 19th century because for the first time, glasshouse grown flowers became widely available, because most of the language, most of the messages you can't send through most of the year because the plants grow in different seasons. So you would have to draw them or something. So plants become available on a much broader scale, not as they are today, but almost. And with that, the nostalgia for a language that means one thing grew already in the 19th century. So at the apex of this language, it was already an expression of nostalgia for things just meaning one thing. And we might resonate with that today with the longing for a language that means only one thing and everybody knows what it does. But what is so interesting is that you can use this language not only because it has been a poetic device. You can go through poetry and look at the lexica from that time and look at, you know, if a special flower has been named a couple of times, you know that this person will probably be familiar with this kind of code. But it also brings together all the different kinds of codes that can be represented with using or distancing oneself as a human from plants, because every plant code represents a specific kind of order of things. And you hear the Foucault shining through it, but I'm not going into that. I'm just pretending we all know what that means. For example, it can represent the chain of being, the kind of hierarchy that puts humans at the top, and as the only really intelligent being that can control every other being. It can be part of the system of nature, of the fantasy of control and classification systems. Again, something that puts a living being at into a specific category and then pretends that it will stay there and be a very nice being and not contest human meaning making. And it also, and this is where this kind of identification of meaning with a certain sign becomes wobbly. It can be part of the story of evolution. So the kind of idea that things become something else while remaining the same, or develop out of something else and having a history. This is the code of flower language, or language of flowers, is the one thing. The other thing that helps or that becomes easier when you're coming from literary scholarship is looking at the ways in which we, meaning humans, anthropomorphize plants. And this is, of course, the great crime that you could commit in science and science communication. And I want to make a case for anthropomorphization or for anthropomorphizing by pointing out how not to do it. And one of the ways, and that's where Pocahontas comes in, I'm just remembering, one of the ways not to do it is to Disneyfy an indigenous way of treating plants. Because in many indigenous cultures throughout the world, and also, I want to add, in many Christian traditions that are not Lutheran and rationalized, plants are part of a creation or part of a world of kinship. So there is no categorical difference between a human and a plant, but a shared sense of living in the world and living together. If you then take this notion of kinship and turn it into, let's say, Grandmother Willow, as in the Disney Pocahontas version, who serves a human, even if that human is depicted, Disneyfied version of an indigenous person, this tree is basically nothing else than the sign you would use in florography. So you put it there to stand for something else, for a human want or desire. And this Grandmother Willow is basically there to be the sassy mirror of Pocahontas's, the movie version's, desires. She is thus, or this anthropomorphized tree is thus very different from the ideas of humanoid arboreal beings such as the Ents in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and I brought you one of the filmic versions of it, and the alien Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy. Groot is very interesting because he refuses to talk much. He only says its name, I am Groot. So it can say I, but it won't learn, in quotation marks, more in order to communicate with humans or to use human language. Thus, it can also be read as a figure of refusal to serve humans. It calls humans to make the effort to understand what Groot says and what Groot means, while Grandmother Willow from the Pocahontas movie really serves and makes sure everybody understands. It's a little mystical, you know, some kind of riddle, and you don't understand it quickly enough, but she makes very clear what she means, and thus serves, while Groot insists more of being himself, I want to say. The ants are so interesting because while they are anthropomorphized with the legs and the arms and an identifiable head and beard, they need to be convinced to speak to humans. They will rather speak to the hobbits, which are also very old beings in this mythology, and will only participate in human matters when they and the trees are threatened. And this is important. They are not trees. Trees is basically a kind of solidified ent. So they say they are in a relationship to trees that is comparable to the relationship a shepherd has to his sheep or her sheep. So it's not, there is a continuity, but it's still a very different kind of existence. And these just as examples for the different modes of anthropomorphization. And there could be much more. Johannes Wankhammer has written a brilliant article on the occasion of Peter Wohling. So literary and cultural plant studies in the shortest way possible. I just wanted to point out the Literary and Cultural Plant Studies Network, which is a great resource for all kinds of research that is happening right now on this topic. It has an actual mission statement, so it will not pretend that it comes without engagement and, let's say, a politics, because literary and cultural plant studies is a way of making sure that plants could take the space, not only in a narrative or a poem, but in the interpretation of humans concerned with text. So the formula is taking the plants out of the background into the foreground, and that doesn't necessarily needs it doesn't need to mean necessarily that the plants talk or have faces, but that they affect what is happening in a story. And once you start reading like this, there will scarcely be a story. Stories without plants become weird, because you notice that just as it is in, for lack of a better word, the real world, plants play an existential role in every kind of relationship where humans move. The question is, do we pay attention to them, and in what way do we pay attention? And I like to put this image there. It's from an elementary school book where you learn about trees, and the only thing you learn is to name the parts of a tree. And then somehow think that you know something about it. And this is where literary and cultural plant studies come in to challenge this notion, and they do so not alone, or we do so not alone, because as I said, in the mid-90s and the early 2000s, plant science began to change dramatically, not only because of all kinds of new ways of DNA test trees and relationships to other plants, and to find all kinds of meanings in plants, but also because many different strands of plant sciences, so forest ecology, you might know, have heard of the term wood wide web, plant neurobiology, which is an oxymoron because plants don't have neurons, but it is a kind of science that tries to figure out whether there's a way of thinking of plants as intelligent or as communicative or as possessing a memory, try to change the epistemic conditions under which questions can be asked in plant science. And that is nothing more and nothing less is what literary and cultural plant studies also tries to do. Not limit ourselves to what is on the page, if you want to think in Gutenberg galaxy terms, but trying to figure out and failing at the ways in which we can think through plants as their own beings. Just as another leg to stand on, plant science is one way of looking at this, plant philosophy is another, and Michael Marder's plant thinking is a seminal way of really going through and establishing the practice of rereading history and texts of history, or in this case, history of philosophy, to challenge the ways in which plants have been put in relation to humans, and to think of plant thinking not only as something plants do, but as of something that humans can aspire to. So when Michael Marder calls plant thinking the non-cognitive, non-ideational, and non-imagistic mode of thinking, he means plant thinking and plant growth are the same thing, which is a challenge because it takes away all the things you would learn in philosophy, you know, and it also takes away the speciality of human beings. It is then a way of moving away from anthropocentric thinking, not anthropomorphic thinking, because that is something that is particularly difficult to do with the human brain, but to consider ways of thinking that are different from our own and refuse to be understood and still are worth considering. I'll skip that in order to get to the botany of it all. So when we're talking about trees, one of the reasons why they're so where they have become the object of so much attention in recent years is that forest ecology, especially the one that centers around the so-called wood wide web, the connection between mycorrhizal fungi and tree roots, and the possibility that they not only exchange or steal from each other the nutrients that they each find or produce. This kind of thinking is one that not only produces new ways of thinking trees not as individual plants or resources, but as part of a network of living things that does not require similarity in order to connect, but also because it so brilliantly shows how we need metaphors, that is, literary practices and literary tools in order to make visible, or let's say bring close to understandable the things that you see in nature. And one of the most interesting people in this, because you could do a whole seminar on Suzanne Simard reception in a literary studies course without even leaving the confines of very traditional literary work, because she has been made into fictional characters. There has been so much written about her. She's part of poetry. She's helping other artists or conversing with many artists doing this, but she's the forest ecologist who first conducted the kind of research that made plausible that the mycorrhizal fungi and plant root connections that were known for 100 years at this point might actually not just be competitive strands of fungi trying to steal all the nutrients from the trees and taking over once they give in, but there might actually be a cooperation or collaboration throughout the forest floor. And what is so interesting, and why I put the nature cover in there, is that she coins these connections in familial terms. So in her terminology, there are mother trees which connect to younger trees through the mycorrhizal fungi, and then have these kinds of family relations in a forest. While the Nature Journal turned this into the terminology of the just recent invention of the World Wide Web. I think You've Got Mail, the Meg Ryan, Tom Hanks movie about getting email and, getting to know people that you haven't actually seen, is from 1996 or something. So the terminology of the Wood Wide Web wouldn't have been too familiar to people. And then you use it to describe an evolutionary, millions of years old phenomenon. But it seemed to make more sense in terms of a technological web of communication than as a natural, whisper network in the forest floor that has been talking all along without us knowing. So framing this as something new made sense, and framing this as something that could have just as well been built by humans also seemed to make sense. Suzanne Simard has since tried to reclaim this idea, and this is a too long quote to read it, but just to show what I do with this. This is a non-fictional text. It's a mixture of a popular science book about the forest ecology that she conducts, and her own life. So it's an autobiography and tree book. I call this a dendro autobiography because I wrote a work of qualification, so I needed to coin a couple of new terms on my own. So this is a dendro autobiography, and there is actually a whole I have a whole collection of them. You wouldn't believe how many, especially female scientists, write their autobiography through the tree science they conduct. And this is especially interesting because Suzanne Simard also designs the story of secrecy going on in the forest. So she plots, whether by accident or not, I don't know, the stories of trees and fungi secretly talking and scientists needing an ear to listen in on this. And not only do scientists and humans in general need to develop a special kind of ear, we also need a special kind of language in order to understand this. And this is where I come in, where lots of scientists and lots of practitioners of ecological thinking, some examples you can see here, claim that what they can witness in non-human, more than human nature cannot fit into scientific language anymore. So they need other kinds of languages. And this is where the poetics come in, because poetics does not necessarily or not solely refer to poetry or poems or literary modes of narrative. It means that the rules in which text, this is poetics or poetology, it concerns the rules after which a text is formed. You would have had up until the 18th century rule books, basically, from Aristotle to, in Germany, Gottsched, for example, that would tell you what kind of text in which form you would have to write to make it fit to a specific occasion. For example, if you would write something and address it to the king, you would have to do that in a specific way and write panegyric, for example, this specific way, and it would tell you down to the metrum of the verse how you would do this. In modern literature, or what we know as literature today, these rules are made up by every single text as it goes along. As I showed you with Adrienne Rich, she gives herself her own rules. And part of interpretation is to find out the rules that the text gives themselves. And when I look at these nonfiction texts now, I try to find out the rules that they give themselves. So the kind of the genres within pop science, within nonfiction that form, just because there are so many that are similar, and market rules dictate that if someone wrote a very successful book, 10,000 follow with just the same pattern. But here you can also see that engaging with and encountering plants changes the way in which we speak. And one of the ways is where the I comes in, or how to address plants. And this is very interesting because it wasn't enough for me to be kind of forced. I'm happy to be forced to engage with botany and forest ecology, but also with anthropological thinking. Because as I mentioned, it's the Western way, not only of science, but of poetry, of narrative, of thinking about the world, of the so-called enlightened way of looking at the world. And I call this so-called because in general language, enlightened means something else than referring to the epoch. And I want to refer to the way of thinking. But this is not the only way. And just to go briefly through a couple of anthropology ways of thinking through forests and the human forest, human tree, human animal, not only networks, but really kinships they form. One of the ways that has impressed me a lot is Eduardo Cohn's attempt to write an anthropology beyond the human. And well, not going into the book itself so much, what interests me is the contradictory notion in this. I mean, why would you have an anthropology which is concerned with the human beyond the human? It is because the human is not enough to understand what happens with the human, because in his research with the Runapuna, Eduardo Kohn found that not only are dreams, for example, important mediums to connect with more than human others, dreams are also what makes humans into the media of the forest. So forests act through humans. Hence, thinking about the human as the only subject, the only being with agency who can control what he or she does, is missing the point, because it's not just, we breathe oxygen, plants make oxygen. It's really a kind of relationship where, in Western term, we would probably talk about a kind of possession, but it's really a not being a master of your own house if your body and your mind are the house we speak of. And that also changes the kind of language. Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass has been a runaway success. If you just look at it from a book publishing point of view, it's already really interesting. She just wrote it. She's a trained botanist, enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation, and learned the Potawatomi language as a second language because it wasn't available to her as a kid. And she takes this practice of braiding sweetgrass and giving it away in order to bring together her botanical, her indigenous, and her wisdom as a mother, in order to form a strand that is stronger than those three things on their own, but that still makes visible that they're not just merged. So she doesn't mix them together, but she weaves, or she braids this, I forgot, was it Zopfes? She makes a braid. She braids the braid. And the interesting thing poetologically, so the rules in which this text works, or which this text formulates for itself, are that it's not all the same. You can still tell the difference between her speaking as a botanist and her speaking as an indigenous person, but she uses ways in bringing those together, but also ways where you can tell that, and of course I would say that sometimes it's very handy to speak with a literary scholar, because, or especially with a comparative literature scholar, because they could have told her that changing the pronouns isn't enough. For those of you who speak German, you will notice that we already do this. We already talk about oak trees, for example, Eiche, as a she. Die Eiche steht im Park. Sie steht im Park is doing exactly what she's claiming here to, which is not to take away from this kind of approaching language, but it also shows how difficult it is and how good we are at not granting more than human others part in our language. So something needs to happen that is more closely situated to, getting a little esoteric here, to the heart of the matter. So to locate granting more than humans access closer or within human bodies. And this is again where poets come in. For example, Sumana Roy, a Bengali poet who wrote, again, a nonfiction book. I would also call this an dendro autobiography, where she observes her own transformation or metamorphosis into a tree. You will note the book is called How I Became a Tree, not how I tried and failed at becoming a tree, how I became a tree. And at the end of this book, she is a tree. I have the pleasure of exchanging emails with her, and I have the pleasure of accepting the fact that apparently I have now exchanged emails with a tree. And you could now take what I said in the beginning, that tree as an aesthetic, a cultural concept, to kind of go like, well, she's a tree in the kind of imaginative way. But she also explores the ways in which we could broaden our idea of what it means to become a tree and what it takes. And what it takes is rigorous scholarship. She reads everything. When I read this book first, and I just started my project, and you might know this feeling, my heart sank, because I was like, no, she already wrote my book. Everything is in there, everything from Ovid through Bengali poets whom I will never be able to read in the original, through her own experiments with recording, for example, the noises that leaves make, and the ways in which her desire to flee human society, which connects her to, of course, the most famous female person who tried to escape patriarchy, which is Daphne in Ovid's Metamorphoses, who turned into a laurel tree, how this desire turned into something that has more utopianism in it than you would expect at first. And it connects her to the plant philosophy and the plant scientists who need to find new ways of expressing themselves and to become less human in order to connect more to the world. That this leads to different ways of conducting research is not only evidenced in what I do, but also in the now very famous The Mushroom at the End of the World by anthropologist Anna Loven-Zinn, who needed to find ways of incorporating storytelling and speculative storytelling into her work in order to write an anthropology that is not like Eduardo Kohns beyond the human, but that connects human and more than human worlds. And the ways in which she tracks how she reads, not only what she reads. She doesn't just do the citation and bibliography thing, but notes down the situations and the purposes for which she reads something, and then how heavy the book is and how it disrupts her own day, and incorporates all of this into her way of talking about plants and people. And to end this with a little bit of self-promotion, and to explain what happens when you turn this into practice, is I had to write 2 books for a practical reason, because I needed the qualification. And the book on the right here, Fremde Verwandtschaft, the German one, is more literary oriented, I would say. So it has chapters that look at novels and, look as if it were proper literary studies. But it also presents things that are not part of a German conversation yet. And the other one is my way of critiquing nonfiction as if it were a fiction. So I look at the kind of rules that people give themselves, and also the ways in which storytelling, narrative, and plot, myth even, becomes part of intervening into ways of understanding the world that are interested more in classification and separation than in connection. And my way of critiquing, and sometimes harshly critiquing, the ways in which people bring these things together and what works and what does not work, is aimed at asking questions that you can then take and ask them in relation to other more than human things, beings, phenomena. You could, which is very closely related, think about stones, for example, think about water, think about things that are much more limitless, or even more limitless than trees. Think about connections where if you sever one part of it, as it would be in symbiosis, you can't talk about it anymore. So think about ways of, let's say, non-invasive science. Think about ways of addressing more than human intelligences, be they artificial or not, by means of questioning your own ability to understand it. And that is a very abstract way of putting it. But what I want to argue with thinking through trees and networks is that if we wait until we understand it, we have probably destroyed it. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much.